Trying to follow up the 2016 release of Doom was never going to be easy. While the previous game wasn't perfect, it was still a glorious romp of intense and insane action. I would have been perfectly fine with more of the same, essentially a retread through new environments and with new enemies. And for the most part, that is what this is. But id Software made some bold moves and experimented quite a bit to make a game that stands apart from its predecessor. Overall, I love it. Some of my bigger issues with the previous game have been resolved, and Doom Eternal is a much faster and more hectic adventure. But there are also some pretty big hangups that I'm not so happy with. The first and foremost being the story. This is going to be the first thing that anyone playing this game will notice in comparison to Doom 2016. Storytelling in Doom Eternal is way more emphasized. That's not to say that there wasn't a story in the previous Doom game, but I felt like its greatest strength lied in its simplicity. There were barely a handful of characters, and more importantly, the game very rarely slowed down. Cutscenes were brief and to the point, but the lack of exposition didn't mean a lack of depth.
You must stop. The hell energy is unusable without the filters.
Warning.
What you are destroying is more valuable than you can possibly imagine. It is perfect.
The storytelling was very well crafted and told only enough to get the point across with very little, or really practically any fluff at all. This gave it a good balance between story and action, which led the game to having a fantastic pace. Doom Eternal, on the other hand, has more cutscenes, they're more drawn out, there are more characters that are important to the plot, and a couple not so much. This isn't to say that the story is bad, it's alright, and the new additions to the Doom lore are pretty interesting. There's an explanation for how hell works, the Sentinels from the previous game are further explored, and a new alien species is introduced. It's all very cool, but I'm not a fan of how often the game feels the need to put a pause on the action. It wouldn't have to do so either if the story wasn't bogged down by so many characters and a compulsion to explain all these environments. So, in the grand scheme of things, I do feel as though the expanded story actually hurts the game more than it helps. Now, I'm not saying that I want a reduction in the environments, but I do believe a more streamlined story, similar to the one in 2016, would have been a better decision. The flashback sequence, going on a quest to kill the 3 Hell Priests, going to the city of the Ancient Sentinels, this is all great and all, but I don't get why we have to have a conversation every time we go somewhere new. If this was the only thing causing the game to drag, then I would gladly give it a pass. But there is more. The occasional tutorial pop-up is a little too frequent for my taste. Sometimes it's merely meant to explain what a button does, and to be fair, Doom 2016 did something similar. But when that's not enough, the player is teleported to a training ground to make sure they understand how to use a chainsaw. Most bizarre of all is that there's a detailed tutorial pop-up for nearly every single enemy in the game, pointing out their specific weaknesses and what the player can do to exploit them. Thankfully, all these tutorials can be turned off in the options, which is a godsend for repeat playthroughs. But it's a shame that they're here in the first place. The game seems to have been balanced around the player having advanced knowledge of how to exploit weak points, which isn't necessarily a terrible idea since it means the game never has to hold back. You're told ahead of time of what you're supposed to do, so we're hitting the ground running. But simply putting up a window to say, hey idiot, this is what you're supposed to do, without even giving the player the chance to experiment first, is extremely lazy. This is not what I've come to expect from id Software. I've done some complaining so far, but there is some real good here. Generally speaking, Eternal's combat is a tremendous improvement, which is crazy considering how good the original game already was. The big new addition here is the ability to perform 2 quick dashes in any chosen direction, either on the ground or in the air. This speeds up the combat a ton, far more than the previous game, and also adds that little bit of extra complexity that was missing. At the same time, Doom Eternal is also far more difficult. Enemies are even more aggressive, no doubt to compensate for the player's new speedy ability. But some other changes have been made as well. The maximum amount of ammo that the player can carry is pitiful in comparison to what it used to be. But this is not a bad thing by any means. What it comes down to is the player now has to make better use of their entire arsenal, including different guns, grenades, and using the chainsaw at the right times. While ammunition and health pickups can be found on the field, performing glory kills by finishing off an enemy with a cinematic melee attack is still the way to go for replenishing your supplies. And it's worth noting that armor is now collected using a separate ability, a shoulder-mounted flamethrower that the Doomslayer can use at any time, but it's on its own cooldown. And this adds yet another layer to the gameplay that you need to keep track of. Chainsaw for ammunition, flame belch for armor, dashing in all directions to avoid attacks. There's a lot more to this game, and I really like what it's doing here. Since the player's ammo reserves are so low this time, weaker enemies play the part of item drops now more than ever. I am very accepting of these changes as it forces the player to more carefully manage their supplies. But I can also see it being too much for some people. Complexity does not necessarily equal depth after all. And now, being forced to juggle all these gameplay elements and new abilities can be seen as annoying. Again, I personally like it, but keep in mind that Doom Eternal does demand more from the player. More controversial, however, will no doubt be the level design. 2016's levels were very large and open, and the transitions between exploratory areas and arenas felt pretty natural, for the most part. With Doom Eternal, it feels more so like a series of arenas stitched together by hallways, platforming challenges, and puzzles. I know it seems weird to say for a game that takes place in hell, but the level geometry feels a lot less natural than it did in the previous game. This isn't something I'm against at all, and I personally prefer a more straightforward approach in games, but it is understandable why others will take this as a step down. Same goes for the, secrets that are scattered throughout the game. This time around, their locations are clearly labeled, and while the path to get to them is still hidden, it's hardly a challenge to get 100% completion. Again, this is a change that I prefer. I hated missing out on potential weapon and ability upgrades before, so it's nice that I won't have to resort to a guide for all the gameplay-centric stuff. And I love the option to fast travel through a level after completing it. On the other hand, it now feels like the game is trying to pad out the time. At this point, why not just reward the player with automatic upgrades after each level as opposed to having them run around and solve little puzzles? The other little secrets, like lore, music, and toys, can stay hidden, and they can provide some replay value for those who wish to explore. But I usually don't like gameplay elements being hidden from the player, or making the player do little chores to unlock them. And in this case, it seems like they did some kind of pointless middle ground between hidden and not hidden. This guy in particular, the Marauder, is also worth bringing up. He was no doubt designed as a rival enemy in response to the player's improved movement options, and his main weakness is based around countering his attacks, specifically when his eyes flash green. Of course, we're given yet another detailed tutorial for this as well. He can be a pretty fun fight one-on-one, but in a group of other enemies he becomes very annoying. He's extremely fast and aggressive, so there's no running away from him, and conventional attacks don't work at all. What I find works best for me is to detonate a rocket launcher right behind him, which he cannot block against. And it works well enough, but the fact remains that this guy hogs all the attention, and he has a ton of health. You can't do a whole lot else until you get rid of him first. And he's obnoxious in the fact that he's the only enemy in the entire game, outside of dedicated boss fights, where you can only beat him in very specific ways. Now, I am aware that there are ways to essentially delete the Marauder, specifically with a shotgun ballista shotgun combo, and that gets rid of him very quickly. However, I don't believe that cheesing this guy is an appropriate solution. And if anything, it just goes to show how broken he is when these are the recommended methods. He deserves special mention for being interesting. He's a pretty cool rival type character for this kind of game, but I don't think he was implemented all that well. And speaking of weaknesses, there's a huge emphasis on targeting specific enemy weak points in order to deal with them far more effectively. For the Arachnotron, it's the overhead turret, and for the Mancubus, it's its arm cannons. Cacodemon coming in close? Feed him a grenade and it's a one-shot kill. I like this idea a lot, in theory, because it adds an extra layer of depth to the combat. However, it's awfully convenient that the weaker weapons are the ones that specialize in taking out weak points. See, for me, I believe Doom Eternal has a similar problem that the previous game did. Half the weapons are obsolete once you get better versions of the same gun. And since they share the same ammo, you're never going to pick the plasma rifle over the ballista, for example. Unless, of course, an enemy with a plasma shield is headed your way. So for that guy, a plasma rifle is highly recommended. To be fair, I do believe that the weapon differences and modifications are handled a lot better this time around. The differences between each gun and their modifications are greater and more creative, but it still is basically a repeat of 2016's arsenal. And I'm not a fan of the weapon bloat either. You basically have 3 different types of machine guns, 2 sniper rifles, and 2 shotguns. Instead of having a single and a double barrel shotgun, just let me fire both barrels independently. And for the underbarrel grenade launcher, well, we can get rid of the chain gun, as blasphemous as that is, I understand, and give it to the assault rifle instead. So the assault rifle can have the underbarrel grenade launcher or the option for those homing rockets. And then you keep the sniper rifle to the dedicated ballista weapon. I believe that something better needs to be done in this case. Either make all of the guns more useful from a general gameplay perspective, or get rid of half of them entirely. Again, it is a step up from Doom 2016, but I don't think they've done enough. However, if my recent podcast is anything to go by, then I'm sure that I'm alone on this one. So take what I say in this case with a grain of salt. As for additional post-game content, there isn't quite a whole lot here. The big standout for me are the master levels, which challenge the player with extra difficult campaign levels that have new enemy placements. Not too dissimilar to how Devil May Cry's higher difficulties will feature totally different enemies. This is a great way to easily extend the life of the game. Although it is a shame that it's strictly the same exact level layouts repeated over again. They could have at least removed the puzzles to make the master level smoother and less annoying, but it's still great as is. It's also a shame that there are only 2 master levels available at launch, and one of them required pre-ordering the game. While more are planned to be available later on, I'd figure that this would have been a fairly easy thing to implement into the game since it's reusing a lot of assets. But still, I think it's an excellent inclusion all the same. However, the big feature that's missing here is Snap Map. Anyone who messed with Snap Map for themselves or watched my previous review will know the insane power and potential creativity behind it. And best of all for me, even the crazier maps are available on consoles as well. The fact that Snap Map isn't here this time is a massive loss. There is some news floating around about how Doom Eternal might get mod support, which would be fantastic, but I'll still miss Snap Map for its unbridled power, comparatively ease of use, and cross-platform compatibility. Maps made on the PC upload to the same server, which can then be downloaded to the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. Compatibility like that is nothing to be scoffed at. Finally, I'd like to go over the multiplayer, because this one is a mess. Conceptually, it's awesome. It's such a cool idea to essentially play an arena that's not too dissimilar from something you'd find in the single-player campaign, but now with very unpredictable results as the enemy team controls a pair of demons. And, playing as the demons, you take the role of both boss and dungeon master by summoning AI-controlled monsters, and it works out surprisingly well. It gives the player demons a lot to do, but it's still fairly easy to manage. There's an interesting balance between the demon summoning monsters to act as distractions, while the Slayer kills the cannon fodder enemies to replenish his supplies. It sounds great on paper, but in practice the odds are severely skewed against the lone Slayer. While the Slayer may have better movement options and way stronger attacks, I feel like the demons still hold the advantage with infinite ammo, being protected by a small army of monsters, and are able to more easily heal themselves while straight up deleting all of the Slayer's supplies on the field. Now, does this mean it's impossible for the Slayer to win? No, of course not. However, it is really imbalanced. The Pain Elemental in particular being able to fly around without any restrictions is insanely busted. It's just not fair to have a constant target right above you taking your attention away from everything else. And of course he can hide better than any other demon too, as well as put up a shield, which leads to easy resurrections. All these demons have something about them that's really busted, and they don't have to work very hard to play effectively. While the Slayer, on the other hand, needs to play at a very high skill level just to stand a chance. I think there's a skill-based matchmaking system going on where your win-loss ratio is represented by the border of your online title, but I don't know how well it works because I'm still getting matched up with anyone. It also seems to combine the wins and losses of both Slayers and Demons, and if that's the case, then it's worthless. Now, if you're a competent mouse and keyboard player, then we're getting somewhere. But it seems a bit much that you're basically required to be able to handle nightmare difficulty in order to perform well as the Slayer in multiplayer. While the Demons, on the other hand, can get by just fine without nearly as much effort. I feel like making all of the demons even weaker than they currently are, both the player demons and summoned AI, would force them to play much more carefully. It would require a careful balance, of course, and that's probably not all there is to it. I believe putting a longer cooldown on the loot block mechanic would be a good step in the right direction as well. But the point is that I don't think the current iteration is the right call. At the very least, this game mode should be a lot of fun with like-minded friends. And if it can be properly rebalanced, then I think there's a lot of potential here. But for the moment, and in comparison to 2016's more traditional multiplayer, just forget it. To be fair, the team at id Software have already taken steps to nerf the Demon team, albeit on consoles only. I believe this is a step in the right direction to ensure that the demons play in a more methodical manner, and it shows that they're at least making an attempt. If they can implement a proper skill-based matchmaking system as well, then we'll be getting somewhere. But it's still pretty inexcusable to me that this wasn't put in at launch. I think the biggest question here is if Doom Eternal is better than 2016, and it's not a very straightforward answer. As far as the pure gameplay goes, I'd say Eternal has it beat hands down, but it doesn't feel quite as well put together. The stronger focus on narrative is misguided in my opinion, and while there is more polished single-player content in the form of the master levels, I do believe it pales in comparison to everything Doom 2016 had to offer. Classic multiplayer deathmatch may have been the safe decision, but they also did it in their own way that made it stand out from the competition. It wasn't as frantic as Quake 3 Arena, but it was a lot more exciting than something like Call of Duty. It played a really nice middle ground in that sense. Doom Eternal's battle mode is really creative and interesting, but I would much rather have 2016's multiplayer. However, the long and short of it is this. Doom Eternal's campaign is fantastic, and if you want more of the same from 2016, but at an even more demanding difficulty, then this is exactly what you'll get. I still think it's a little too short, a similar problem with 2016, and it also has a few flaws here and there. Some of the levels have really obnoxious roadblocks like this purple ooze that slows you down, and I didn't really care for the swimming segments. It ain't what I'm here for, and it felt like a waste of time. So because of that, I would overall recommend 2016 to most players. And after that, if you want even more, go straight for Doom Eternal, because when it's good, it's so good. And it still manages to be a gold standard for first-person shooters. And it's probably going to continue to be one of the best there is for years to come. Thanks for watching my review on Doom Eternal, and if you want further thoughts, then I have a 3-hour podcast that I recently uploaded to my channel.